Hello and welcome to a special episode of Nothing But the Truth. In a couple of hours, President Obama will arrive in India and make history. He's the first US president to visit India twice during his tenure and the first to be chief guest at Republic Day. Not surprisingly, the visit has produced enormous excitement, but also huge expectations. So today, over the next 1 hour, with a very special list of guests, I shall look at what this visit can achieve. Our focus will be both on deliverable outcomes as well as expectations that may not be fully met. So if you really want to understand what the Obama visit can achieve, stick with us over the next 1 hour. My guests are two former foreign secretaries, Krishnan Srinivasan, who was also the ambassador in the Netherlands and Bangladesh, and Lalit Mansingh, who was ambassador in Washington and High Commissioner in London. I also have the Geostrategic Director of the IISS, Sanjay Baru, the Strategic Affairs Editor of the Business Standard, Ajay Shukla, the Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, and the Director of the South Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, Frederick Graer. Krishnan Srinivasan, everyone is saying, including this government, that Obama is the first American president to be invited as chief guest for Republic Day. But the truth is, he's not. You, when you were Foreign Secretary, are aware of the fact that Narasimha Rao invited Clinton to be chief guest for Republic Day 1995. First of all, am I right in saying that? And secondly, why did Clinton not accept?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's nothing but the truth, to quote the title of your program. When Narasimha Rao went to Washington, this was I think in May, June 1994, he came back very impressed by President Clinton. And a month or so later, he asked me to sound the President to find out whether he would be agreeable to be our chief guest for Republic Day 1995. Rather than using the normal diplomatic channels like our embassy there or their embassy in Delhi, I decided to phone Strobe Talbot, who was then the Deputy Secretary of State, that is to say the Deputy Foreign Minister. And Strobe Talbot got back to me very, very quickly, maybe within 24 or 36 hours, to say that Clinton was extremely gratified to get the invitation, but the State of the Union address was his great priority. He couldn't change the timing, and he regretted, therefore, he wasn't able to come. As you know, these invitations are always preceded by an informal approach, because no one really wants to be embarrassed by the fact that an invitation to such a high-profile event has been declined.
Now, Frederick Graer, in fact, President Obama has actually shifted the State of the Union address, something that Clinton in '95 was not prepared to do. Is that, therefore, a mark of how important he thinks this visit is?
Oh, quite clearly, there is a willingness to reset the relationship, to reset the dynamic which existed under Bush and Manmohan Singh, and to relaunch the relation on a new base. So yes, his acceptance to be the chief guest on the 26th is clearly an indication that the U.S. is willing to develop positively this relationship.
And shifting the State of the Union address is a mark of that.
Absolutely. I mean,
Mr. Mansingh, let's come to some of the issues that the two heads of government are going to have to face when this visit gets underway in a couple of hours' time. And let's start with the civil nuclear issue. There are reports in Indian papers, and in several of them, that the two governments believe that they have come very close to, perhaps they have already resolved, the problems over India's nuclear liability law. Do you believe that those reports are credible, or do you think there's a certain amount of wishful thinking here?
No, I think one thing you must give credit to this government for. They are trying to find solutions for what used to be regarded as intractable issues. The trade facilitation agreement was one of them.
I'll come to trade later. Stick to civil nuclear.
I was giving an example. Everybody assumed that our law is so rigid there is no way out. But I think discussions are taking place on trying to find a solution going around the law and not challenging the law.
And yet staying within the parameters of Indian legislation.
So there has been a lot of progress on that, but there is a lot of fine-tuning to be done. Whether they announce an agreement or not, I do not know, but I think there is a serious attempt to find a solution.
Sanjay Baru, it all hinges on whether the idea of an insurance pool set up by GIC to take care of the right of recourse under Section 17B, as well as the willingness of the two countries to devise a legally binding assurance that gives them a guarantee, or gives the Americans a guarantee, that there will be no recourse to tort under Indian law, can be sufficient for the Americans. Do you think it can be sufficient, or is it just enticing, but will it fall short?
Karan, I'm reminded of the situation we were in 10 years back on the nuclear deal, when everybody thought the problem was the specifics. But the solution was that the US president told his guys, fall in line, I want this deal done. And it was done. And I think we are in exactly the same position today, except it's not the US president, but the Indian Prime Minister who has told his people, fall in line, I want the agreement done. And I'm pretty sure it'll get done.
But does fall in line, I want the deal done, mean that Mr. Modi will accept legally binding assurances that circumvent Indian requirements and law?
I don't know I'm not inside government. I don't know the details. From whatever I know, I can tell you with some knowledge that these are all specifics which can be worked out. I think the confidence in the system is it is possible to find a way out. And therefore, a way out will be found.
There is another problem to the nuclear issue that the Indian side has not highlighted, or at least the Indian press hasn't highlighted, but the Americans are much more aware of, and that's the question of tracking and also accounting for nuclear materials supplied by the Americans. The Americans want a control over that tracking mechanism. India believes it should be done under the auspices of the IAEA, with whom they've been negotiating. Is that a more intractable problem?
No, that's actually something anyway that will come after liability. If liability is not solved, then the administration of fissile material agreement doesn't even matter.
Except information on television suggests through sources that this now is the hurdle that they're facing at the moment.
It is they are trying to get that negotiated because it would be just nice to have that agreement ready. But ultimately, it is completely irrelevant if liability is not solved. And I would disagree with Dr. Baru on one point. The real problem with liability is that it is a business-to-business issue. In other words, U.S. corporations, not only just U.S. corporations, Indian private corporations, their lawyers have to come in and say this is acceptable to the laws of accounting and legal liability that our books have to put on. So government to government can do whatever they want. But if the corporate lawyers come in and say the pool insurance is not acceptable by our own standards, our simple laws of our own accounting, then it is irrelevant what the government
So you're suggesting that even if the two governments can come to an understanding on the liability issues, beyond that there's another obstacle, and that's the lawyers of the concerned companies, GE and Westinghouse, they have to be assured that it's acceptable to them.
Not just Westinghouse, it is companies like Godrej, L&T, Kirloskar.
Sure. But those are Indian companies. From the American side, the two companies with their lawyers...
Same law.
Sure.
Same law applies to both, and Indian companies have refused to build or contract any nuclear components to NPCIL since the law has been passed.
In other words, are you saying that the formula that the Indian government is seeking with the Americans is already unacceptable to Indian companies?
Well, they're waiting to watch. I've talked to a couple of lawyers of these companies privately, and they at present are highly suspicious as to whether the pool insurance will be sufficient.
It seems, Krishnan Srinivasan, that there are significant issues on this entire nuclear liability front that still need to be sorted out. The reports on television through sources is that, in fact, the tracking issue is becoming an obstacle, but maybe liability also is an obstacle. Can these issues, as Sanjay Baru suggests, be sorted out once Obama reaches Delhi and the two heads of government sit down together, or will by then the issue be too late?
I think honestly we're racing against time on a whole wide range of proposals. Our Prime Minister's visit to Washington was only a few months ago. A huge number of groups and subgroups were set up to deal with a wide-ranging number of proposals. I wouldn't at all be surprised if many of them did not fructify by the time of this visit, and I would say that would apply to the nuclear liability clause as well as the tracking and monitoring issue. So it wouldn't hugely surprise me. But of course, I think both governments would very much like to see some marquee decisions during the visit. But I don't think all is lost if some of these marquee decisions, in fact, don't materialize.
Now, Another area, Ajay Shukla, where in fact the two governments hope they can have, to use Krishna Srinivasan's phrase, a marquee agreement, is in fact a new defense framework agreement. It's believed that it's already been negotiated, it's waiting to be signed, and it will replace the one that Dr. Manmohan Singh's government negotiated in 2005. In what ways will this new DFA be an improvement on the old one, and how significant an achievement will the agreement on it turn out to be?
Well, the significance will turn out to be based on what the specific clauses are and how they work for the United States and India. The problem with the last framework agreement, that's the 2005 agreement, was that it was intensely ambitious. It spelled out 13 specific areas of cooperation in areas like sharing of intelligence and joint planning of exercises and so on. But none of that ever really fructified on the ground, partly because of the Antony Defense Ministry's reluctance to engage with the Americans. So the Americans would, invoking the framework agreement, forward a proposal to the MOD, but there would be no response at all from the Indian side. And that was intensely galling to the Americans. So what they've tried to do in this particular framework agreement, in the 2015 framework agreement, is to have a monitoring mechanism, a periodic review mechanism where the two sides can sit down together, talk about issues that need to be taken forward and so on, rather than just the Americans writing to the MOD and receiving no response. So if the Americans are satisfied in this respect, then that will be a big thing. Rather than just laying down a very ambitious agenda of cooperation which is never implemented.
Frederick, two areas where it seems the Americans are not going to get what they're hoping for, or at least their hopes won't fructify immediately. The first is the bilateral investment treaty. India is negotiating, or reviewing rather, the treaties it's already signed with other countries, and it doesn't want to sign a new one until that review is over. And the other area where there may still be differences is intellectual property rights. The two countries have moved a lot closer, but I'm told significant differences remain. Now, on those two fronts, will the Americans be disappointed, or will they take it in their stride?
Well, I think there is still a lot of work to be done on those two fronts, and that's going to be a key issue for the evolution of the relationship. The problem that we see is that everything which is government to government will evolve at its own pace and will probably evolve positively. Now, we are talking of a set of issues which concern directly the private sector, and therefore which is outside the decision-making process of the government, and that's where the big question mark is. And this is something that is not simply a matter of what Mr. Modi and Mr. Obama will decide over the weekend.
Okay, that's very interesting. So what you're saying is that the two governments are aware that the government-to-government business will happen, but it could take a lot longer than the expectations aroused in the press.
Absolutely. The question that we are seeing today is that, the way I see it, at least in Delhi, in DC, is that the private sector is very cautiously optimistic. There were a lot of expectations before the election, which have only been partly met, and now they're waiting to see what's going to happen on the ground. But I mean, again, as much as you can manage government expectation, it's much more difficult to manage the private sector expectation, and that's going to be the key issue for the relationship.
Well, you know, on that point, Sanjay Baru, about managing private sector expectations, there's enormous expectation from the Indian information technology sector that some understanding, even if it's not a full-fledged agreement on totalization, is possible. Some liberalization of the visa regime, particularly because the L1 and the H1B visas are going to become substantially more expensive in the near future. Once again, it looks as if those two understandings, leave-aside agreements, are not going to be achieved. Will the Indian private sector be understanding?
The Indian private sector, I think, by and large, has a very positive approach to the bilateral relationship. In fact, even the American private sector. And what is interesting about the American business that I've interacted with is that those who are happy doing business in India, in fact, don't want to talk about it, because back in the United States, it's not very popular to be seen as actually exporting jobs. It's the ones who are unhappy that end up talking about their unhappiness. So we hear more about the negatives, about the difficulty of doing business in India. But I know any number of American companies which are actually doing business here, employing literally thousands and thousands of workers in Hyderabad, Bangalore, Chennai, Pune, across Gujarat, and they're all very happy.
That's a very interesting
And so
point.
about Indian business in the US, I think the H1, the visa issue is an issue for the IT sector, but by and large, Indian business's attitude towards the relationship, in fact, is an extremely positive.
That's a very interesting point he's making. I'm going to ask you, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, if you agree. And what he's really suggesting is that whether you're talking about American businessmen or Indian businessmen, what they have to say in public is probably just rhetoric and for domestic political consumption purposes, and is substantially belied by the actual business involvement they have in each other's countries, and therefore don't take what they say in public at face value.
Well, no, there are, I mean, it's clearly true that 99% of the businesses who are doing business in India don't have any major problems, and vice versa, otherwise they wouldn't be doing business in the first place. But as Frederick has correctly pointed out, there are a number of core areas where there are clearly policy frictions. One of them is the nuclear liability issue, in which both Indian and American nuclear companies have come together and said the present law has to change. And the pool insurance is essentially, as one lawyer told me, a band-aid.
But move on beyond pool insurance, totalization, visas and things.
Exactly, and you're going to get no progress whatsoever.
So you disagree substantially with Sanjay Basu?
There's a difference. There are companies that are dependent on H and L visas for their business. Some of them don't use H and L visas, or some of them get enough that they don't care. But totalization, nothing will happen, because if you look at what's happened...
And that will matter to Indian companies?
It will matter, though, to those specific companies that are dependent on H and L visa. Totalization doesn't matter.
That's the point at which you disagree with Sanjay Basu?
Yeah, because right now Obama has an immigration law reform package before Congress, and he has a Republican Congress that is saying we will never pass this over our dead bodies.
Right.
He has no authority. So.
Broadening the picture beyond totalization and visas to the bigger trade front, Indo-US trade reached a total of about $90 billion by the end of 2013. The two governments are committed to pushing it up to $500 billion. And sometimes they say they hope to do that by 2020, which may be a bit unrealistic. But the two countries don't have a trade agreement. How much of a problem is that?
Well, countries which are free economies don't have trade agreements. But when you're talking about something like a bilateral investment treaty, that helps trade. And I think we're at the beginning of the process of negotiating a serious BIT. But these talks take a long time because there's a lot of fine print to be agreed on. Remember that with the European Union, we've been negotiating for about 6 years or more for a free trade agreement. So I'm not worried about this.
So time, in other words, is on our side, because the experience of the past is these things take a lot longer than people think.
They take a lot longer, but incrementally, when the economies open up, I think trade tends to go up. Now, one thing we must notice also, almost 25 to 30% of bilateral trade is services. And this is where the totalization agreement is important.
Absolutely.
So while we are exporting about $15 billion worth of services, we are paying a tax of $3 billion to the Americans, which is actually supposed to be returned to us.
Once again, you also are disagreeing with the position taken by Sanjay Basu.
Our industry is serious.
Let him clarify.
I'm not saying the totalization issue is not an issue. I'm saying that the overall experience of Indian business is a positive one. There are sectors in which there are, there are problems.
And so don't overblow the
Absolutely.
problem.
I mean, $3 billion is a big deal for a few companies, but if you take it, the total bilateral relationship is something India can live with.
You wanted to come in at that point?
Yeah, simply that, I mean, I have no objection to what Sanjay is saying. Clearly, the people who are doing business here are pretty happy to do business here. But if you look at the total FDI since 2000 till 2013, then you see that clearly the US is investing less than much lesser economy. And this is what needs to be resolved in many ways for the relationship to really take off.
In other words, you need to increase the levels of American investment and fairly substantially at that.
Which means that more attractivity for the Indian economy.
Moving away from trade, moving away from trade-related issues, Ajay Shukla, there is another area where there's an enormous expansion taking place in the relationship between the two countries. And that is the area of intelligence sharing, and there's now talk about some sort of agreement on cyber security. Are the two governments likely to become closer and closer on these fronts? And is that another area where Mr. Parekar's attitude and response will be significantly different to Mr. Antony, who was much more cautious, much more wary?
Well, intelligence sharing and cybersecurity are not normally dealt with by the Ministry of Defense, at least not as primary interfaces. That would be done with the national security agencies, between American intelligence agencies and on the Indian side, IB and RAW and so on. So those are really professionals talking to professionals, and these are dialogues which will not feature in any joint statement. You will not hear anything about them during the visit, except maybe a couple of anodyne statements about greater cooperation. But from what we hear from the professionals who are actually engaged in this dialogue and in this interface right now, the Indian side believes that there has been a complete quantum jump in the intelligence relationship between the two sides, that the United States is now sharing real actionable information with the Indians, and presumably, though the Indians don't say it, the Indians are passing on information to the United States that they find valuable as well. So this is not stuff that we'll hear about, but this is certainly information that is valuable to India, and it's something which will be personally driven by the National Security Advisor, given his background in intelligence.
Krishnan Srinivasan, as a former Foreign Secretary, in your eyes, how significant and how revealing is the new intelligence relationship between Washington and Delhi? And is it a sign that real meaning is being brought into this concept that we are strategic or natural partners?
Well, we've had this kind of a promise of security and intelligence cooperation for many, many years now. And we haven't really found it extremely, let us say, not extremely credible. Because there have been issues like the Headley issue where the cooperation was far from satisfactory. So I'm very relieved to hear that there might be a kind of a new attitude to this. It would certainly be beneficial to us, and certainly, I think, beneficial to the United States also.
Okay.
We will never achieve the kind of plateau that the United States has with Anglo-Saxon countries, Britain, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. But even if we can have some intense cooperation on issues that we consider intrinsic to our security, both American and Indian, I think that will be a huge step forward. This, of course, depends on a certain convergence in regard to strategic issues close to home, as far as we are concerned. Now, that is another issue, but I'll leave that till later.
Sanjay Baru, one last issue before I take a break and come and talk about the political dimension of this relationship, and that's the question of reforms. The government, using the ordinance route, has pushed through reforms in insurance, land acquisition and coal. On retrospective taxation, they haven't actually reversed what the Manmohan Singh government did, but they've promised they won't do it again. To some extent, not an awful extent, the American businessman is going to look to the American government to see, is this satisfactory? How will Obama view all of this? As sufficient or insufficient and inadequate?
Well, certainly not as sufficient, but I think certainly as a positive movement forward. I don't think it's a coincidence that almost all this activity on economic policy began almost the day after Prime Minister Modi tweeted that he was inviting President Obama to come for the Republic Day parade. And you saw a lot of activity after that in terms of ordinances and various announcements. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was actually a concerted effort leading up to the Vibrant Gujarat Summit in Ahmedabad last month. And we had John Kerry at the Vibrant Gujarat Summit. All the messages from the international participants there, including what's coming out of Davos in the last few days, is positive. Of course, everybody expects India to do more. Indians expect India to do more, right? So I don't think it's...
And so do the Americans.
Everybody. I mean, all businessmen want us to do, the government to be more active in getting the economy going.
This is sounding a bit like Oliver Twist. Please, sir, can I have some more? But, the American Indian scholar Ashley Tellis wrote in September, shortly after the Prime Minister had visited, that American businessmen were willing to wait for the second generation reforms that they believe are critical until the budget. But if by then they haven't happened, Tellis said, these businessmen are going to conclude that if a man with Modi's mandate can't bring transformational change, then that change is unlikely to happen, and they'll begin to look elsewhere, and India will drop in priority. Would you accept that for American businessmen, the budget is a test, a critical litmus test moment?
Well, the budget in the sense that there's specific legislation attached to the budget, which they're looking out for. So yes, they're looking at FDI insurance. They're looking to see whether the GST bill is at least tabled in Parliament, and they're hoping to see that the government will be a little more. I mean, the government has said no new tax cases, but the fact is the tax law hasn't changed, so you can theoretically still introduce or impose retroactive taxes. And as has been mentioned, the other problem is that not just Indian, US companies, Indian companies are not investing in India because of the same reason. They're waiting for these actual pieces of legislation. So yes, the budget is an artificial test. You can theoretically say to the government, we can still pass that legislation 6 months down the line. But each time there's a further delay, then one or two more companies are going to say, well, we can't sit on the money that we have. We'll take it to Indonesia or we'll take it somewhere
So what
else.
you're saying is sooner the better for
Absolutely.
everyone.
Yes.
Al Chaudhry and the director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, Frederick Graer. Krishnan Srinivasan, everyone is saying, including this government, that Obama is the first American president to be invited as chief guest for Republic Day. But the truth is, he's not. You, when you were Foreign Secretary, are aware of the fact that Narasimha Rao invited Clinton to be chief guest for Republic Day 1995. First of all, am I right in saying that? And secondly, hello and welcome to a special episode of Nothing But the Truth. In a couple of hours, President Obama will arrive in India and make history. He's the first US president to visit India twice during his tenure and the first to be chief guest at Republic Day. Not surprisingly, the visit has produced enormous excitement, but also huge expectations. So today, over the next 1 hour, with a very special list of guests, I shall look at what this visit can achieve. Our focus will be both on deliverable outcomes as well as expectations that may not be fully met. So if you really want to understand what the Obama visit can achieve, stick with us over the next 1 hour. My guests are two former foreign secretaries, Krishnan Srinivasan, who was also the ambassador in the Netherlands and Bangladesh, and Lalit Mansingh, who was ambassador in Washington and High Commissioner in London. I also have the geostrategic director of the IISS, Sanjay Baru, the strategic affairs editor of the Business Standard, Ajay Shukla, the foreign affairs editor of the Hindustan Times, Pramit Pal. Why did Clinton not accept?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's nothing but the truth, to quote the title of your program. When Narasimha Rao went to Washington, this was I think in May, June 1994, he came back very impressed by President Clinton. And a month or so later, he asked me to sound the President to find out whether he would be agreeable to be our chief guest for Republic Day 1995. Rather than using the normal diplomatic channels like our embassy there or their embassy in Delhi, I decided to phone Strobe Talbot, who was then the Deputy Secretary of State, that is to say the Deputy Foreign Minister. And Strobe Talbot got back to me very, very quickly, maybe within 24 or 36 hours.